Hello and welcome. I'm Zach Whitaker, the security editor at TechCrunch. Thanks for joining us today for this session on how to prioritize security at your startup. Our guest speaker for this session is Casey Ellis, the founder, chairman, and chief technology officer at Bugcrowd. Casey founded Bugcrowd almost a decade ago to help companies get access to the best cybersecurity talent, like hackers and security researchers, to find and report bugs and other security vulnerabilities. By helping companies shore up their defenses, it makes it much more difficult for malicious hackers to break in. And that's precisely why we're excited to have Casey here today to talk about prioritizing security at your startup. Casey brings unique insights on what companies can and should do to protect themselves and their customers from an ever-growing list of security threats. In this session, we'll hear why startups should prioritize security now and not later, and what startups can do to get there. But before we dive in, I'd like to remind you to submit your questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, as we won't be monitoring the chat. After this presentation, we'll get to as many questions as we can, so feel free to submit them through the Q&A button. And with that, I'll hand over to Casey.
Thank you very much, sir. Good morning, everyone. That was a rousing introduction. Looking forward to chatting today. As Zach mentioned, my name's Casey Ellis. Looking forward to talking through how to prioritize security for your startup. Thank you very much to TechCrunch for having me on and for putting on this event. It's a great time, and I think the idea of being able to get people together and actually impart experience into seed and early stage people. We're at a time in history where technology really matters, and so it's quite a privilege to be able to share today. But let's start with some real talk. The topic of the title of the talk is how to prioritize security at your startup. Priority means the first things, the top things, the priorities, the actual things that you're doing before everything else. And the reality is, if you're seed or series A, you're probably not actively prioritizing security within your organization. It's probably there as something that you are thinking about. If you're doing something in cybersecurity itself, or cryptocurrency, an area where security is a fundamental product, part of your product, it might be on top of your radar. But for everyone else, it tends to be the thing that you kind of worry about in the back of your mind as you're getting on with doing all of the other stuff. So really, the idea of this talk is to acknowledge that as the starting point. I actually think that's a rational place to start, because frankly, getting hacked's not your biggest problem. Your next payroll check is. But as you grow, all of a sudden you become interesting to the adversary. And if you don't start thinking about it now, at that point in time, or even earlier, it can actually become a real issue that affects both you and your users. So, okay, who the heck's this guy? As Zach mentioned, Casey from Bugcrowd, the founder, chairman, and CTO of Bugcrowd, started the company about 8 years ago. So, it's been rocking along for a long time, but we'll get to that shortly. I've been in security basically since I finished high school. So I've seen a lot of interesting stuff. My journey from a professional standpoint started off as a hacker, even before getting into security as a career. Actually worked as a penetration tester. So as someone who basically breaks into people's stuff to tell them how it's done so they can fix it. Moved from that into sales and solutions architecture, and kind of moved to the dark side and started doing some of the sales and business end of things as well. And eventually that all kind of coalesced. I got it in my head I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and broke bad, started doing that sort of thing, which is really when Bugcrowd actually came about as an idea. We pioneered the crowdsourced security as a service model back in 2011 when we started working on it, 2012 when we first launched. I'm very proud of that, because I think in the time that we've been working on it, a lot of things have happened. Obviously, security's become far more important to the average consumer. It's become far more important to the average business. And the part that I quite like is that hackers have gone from being, these criminals almost by default, to us being at a point now where the concept of a digital locksmith and not just digital burglars exist in the minds of the population, which I think is pretty cool. As you can probably hear, I am from Australia, proud husband and father of two, and I'm normally from San Francisco. I'm actually doing this from Sydney, Australia. We basically came down here at the start of the pandemic to be with family. Looking forward to getting back to the US, but doing it from down under for this particular webinar. So that's me. What is Bugcrowd? Zach touched on it in the intro, but this really forms, I think, some of the context of the advice that I'm going to give. And really what we're going to go through is a couple of key takeaways, but then a bunch of very practical tips These slides will be made available later for you to be able to refer back to, and I'm going to try to go through them, but then, give some practical things, dive in, really try to, give everyone in the audience, regardless of where you're up to, something to lock into and something to actually go and work on next. But yeah, what is BugCrowd? What is my experience as a founder of an early stage company? And how does that relate to the advice I'm giving here? Not just the experience that I and we have from a security industry standpoint. Basically, what we do is we take the global population of hackers, white hat hackers, or however you want to frame them. It's the good people that think like bad people, that can come in and actually help with security feedback in your organization to make it more secure. We take that, we corral it onto our platform. We run bug bounty programs, we run vulnerability disclosure programs, and then we also do things like crowdsourced pen testing and attack surface discovery. And really, the way it works is that we've got this community management of this very creative, like phenomenal, chaotic, interesting community of people that can come in and provide this input. And then we've built this platform to basically house all of that, and they then get communication and important data from them to our customer and back again. The whole purpose of it is to create this feedback loop between people that are building products, trying to keep them secure, but mostly thinking about how to make them work, right? So not necessarily always thinking about breaking and what can go bad, but then the breakers on the other side that can provide that feedback. So really what we've done is we've created this platform that was kind of designed to be hacked from day one, which is normally not true. Normally you become interesting to an actual attacker, when you start to do transactions, when you start to get press, when you start to grow or become financially attractive as a target. For us, it was actually built into our business model. So on our first day, we were, as I said, corralling this community of people for the purpose of having them break everything they touch, to actually create that feedback and understand what can be fixed, including, and especially in the early days, our own platform, right? On top of that, we were doing a vulnerability disclosure and actually a public bug bounty program, which essentially goes to asking the entire internet to come and hack our stuff. And in the meantime, convincing the market, as I said, that hackers are okay. There are folks like myself and others out there that, look like the people that you're scared of, but we're actually here to help. And there's a lot of us. Safely store the vulnerability data of our customers, which is obviously very important data and stuff that we want to make sure that we take very close care of. And lead our category in cybersecurity. As I mentioned, this didn't exist when we showed up. So in part, what we took on as a responsibility was actually defining the category well and leading it into something that today is quite a bit larger. I mean, BugCrowd's obviously grown, but it's grown even outside of us to something that's actually established as a category in the industry, as well as all of the other normal stuff that, even the listeners on this webinar that aren't doing security stuff would be thinking about, create, validate a category, move fast, break things, fundraise and hire, out execute competition, get mad write-ups in TechCrunch and build awareness, convince big customers that we're not going to get hacked ourselves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this goes back to my initial real talk point around prioritization. Like, how did we do that? How did we do that successfully? What are the things that hopefully you all can take away from to implement within your own organizations? And like all of these things, juggling them, I would think that if you're not working in this type of area of security, would all sound a little bit crazy by now. It's like, wait, you're going to build a platform, do all of the things, actually expose yourself as an entrepreneur to a market that's kind of trying to kill you right from the get-go. Just to be able to exist and actually grow as a business, because that is a chunk of what it's like, and it's awesome at the same time because you get to solve problems and do really cool things. But on top of that, add all of this hacker stuff on top. The story is that 8 years later, it's working, and that's part of the context for this talk. $80 million raised, we've crushed hundreds of thousands of bugs, $40 million plus paid out to the crowd, and so on. So, so far so good. So really, the first takeaway I think for everyone is to teach your business to wash its hands while it's still young. Security becomes a lot easier or a lot more difficult to retrofit as you get larger as an organization. One of the advantages that BugCrowd had on this side, from my experience and from our experience as a business, is that because we were thinking about it from day zero, it became easy to just continue that inertia. And I think that's a really important principle. And here's a couple of tips on where you all can do that. So the first one, very simple. Try not to reuse passwords. Kill password reuse. It's like a really, really, really common way that organizations, that platforms, that all sorts of different things get hacked. The easiest way to do that is to use an enterprise password manager. And again, start while you're small. Rolling that sort of thing out across 200, 500, 1,000 people is a pain. Implementing it with 5 people and then growing from there is a whole lot easier. So that's the kind of thing that you can just start doing now. There's a bunch of them out there, obviously, 1Password, Keeper, LastPass, there's a ton. And really it just comes down to picking the one that you think is going to fit best with your organization and getting going. The second is use two-factor authentication. So for those of you who don't know what that is, it's the thing where if you put a password in, it also asks you to read off a number from your phone or respond to a message or press a button somewhere else. It's this whole idea of, it basically operates on the assumption that if you just know the password, then we still need a little bit more proof that you're the person that you say you are. And it's becoming, I think, pretty much the standard, especially for critical accounts like email. Obviously within startups, you're going to have things like finance systems and banking and all that sort of stuff. I think especially email and some of those areas where, password resets and all sorts of, social logins and all those sorts of things, they're the ones to do first. But ultimately, you want to try to roll out two-factor across your entire organization. There's stuff like Authy within your product itself. There's things like Duo that you can implement. There's all sorts of solutions there. But just in general, get thinking about that, because you could probably go to your email provider right now and turn that on for your organization if it's not already switched on. And again, hard to do when you're 200, 500 to 1,000 people, really easy to do when you're 5 to 10 people and you just continue on doing it. Applying updates. And for the security folk that are watching, you're like, these are the basics, but this is why I refer to it as washing your hands. Like most people actually kind of don't. And honestly, a lot of the lessons that we're learning from the pandemic are actually translating quite neatly across into being able to explain security. It's very much the simple things that actually get you quite a ways ahead before, the more complicated things start to kick in. Keeping your software up to date, keeping your laptops up to date. In the product itself, if you're, for example, building something in IoT, make it self-update. Your users aren't going to log into that thing and apply an update. Don't expect them to do that. Make it happen automatically and build that into the product itself. Automate it wherever you possibly can. Updating is annoying. It's hard. It's a fact of software because, people like Bugcrowd come in and break it. It needs fixing and that triggers an update, or there's new features or whatever else. It's a fact of software. And I think, planning ahead of that and actually making that a priority in your business, again, while you're small, is a fairly easy thing to do. And it's a pretty huge win. And then use platforms. This whole idea, I think, particularly technology-driven startups will have a tendency to really focus on wanting to build all the different things that are going to actually contribute to the business. From a security standpoint, it makes more sense to outsource the things that aren't core to your organization. If it's not core intellectual property, if it's something that you can afford to give to an expert, including the security of that thing to an expert, do that and focus on the things that you need to do to make your business unique and valuable. And that's where you can focus your security effort as well. All right, so I'm going to pause for a breath there. And as you can see, the sun's starting to come up down here in Sydney as well. So, good morning and good evening and whatever time of day it is for those that are watching right now. So takeaway number 2, make secure easy and insecure obvious. I heard this, it was Diego Manica, who's a phenomenal security strategist, just kind of threw this line away in the middle of a talk one time, and it just literally burnt into my brain almost as a bumper sticker. This idea of like that really being the goal of everyone who's involved in building a business and building a product as it relates to security is to make it as easy as possible and to make the wrong thing as obvious as you can. Security is inherently difficult. It's one of those things where, it's easier to pass through a hole in the wall than it is to get your keys out and unlock a door and do all of that sort of stuff. So there's degrees of difficulty that security inherently introduces, but you want to make it as easy as you can. So here are a couple of suggestions there. Avoid singular failure. And this is a really easy mistake for startups to make, because, you know, if you've got one founder or one person that's doing the hacking while the other does the hustle, you know, there's all sorts of scenarios that kind of create this condition where one person ends up with all of the access to all of the different accounts, and there's some sort of change that needs to happen, or some sort of access that's required, or even an incident that needs to be responded to, and you can't get in. Have two primary owners on all key service accounts. That's just a really practical availability consideration, but it's something that I think has a pretty profound impact on security as well. And again, it's easy. It's one of those things where, you know, this affects ease, because, you know, two people having access is going to make making changes and doing all of those sorts of things a lot more straightforward to actually execute on. It makes insecure obvious because it's more than one person catching something weird going on those accounts. If all of a sudden there's weird behavior happening on your main services account for all of your different applications, for example, one person might miss it, but the other person might catch it. So you're making secure more obvious with this particular example. And again, zero cost, very easy to implement, things that you can start to do right now. I like this one. It's instill productive paranoia in your entire team. And keep in mind that security is not just an engineering problem. I think that this is a mistake that organizations of all sizes make. They reduce cybersecurity down to this issue of, you know, the IT team or the DevOps team or the engineering team producing code. You know, the reality is that the finance team can have as profound an impact on the overall risk of the organization as someone pushing a line of code into production. Same goes for marketing, sales, and whatever else. So what you want to try to do is instill this idea of like, yeah, the boogeyman's real. We actually need to take care of our data. We need to take care of our users. We need to take care of the code that we're writing, and really the trust that our customers are placing in us to do all of that stuff well. Part of the way you do that is by really, you know, having your team internalize the fact that bad stuff can and does happen if you do it wrong. For us, you know, the initial version of this was basically we'd run around, you know, offering to buy lunch or posting, you know, sketchy things on LinkedIn, or changing keyboard layouts to Dvorak if people left their keyboards unlocked. That's a quintessentially hackery approach to the problem. And it obviously started to change as we got a HR department, because, you know, people eventually start getting upset about that sort of thing. But that whole idea of like, you know, how do you gamify internally and make it fun, and like don't turn it into a name and shame thing, turn it into something that's actually just a reminder that, yeah, okay, you know, if I do these little things like leave my laptop unlocked, even within the office, it means that I haven't built in the muscle memory to lock my laptop as I walk away, which if I do that in a cafe or an airport or a hotel, creates a security impact potentially for the organization. That's one example. Downstream of that, you've got all sorts of different organizations that are doing security awareness, I think, better. Security, we'll get to compliance in a second, because it's a question I get asked a lot by early stage founders. But, you know, security awareness is often a part of compliance. I personally believe that checkbox security awareness, you know, it's good to read through a bunch of things and listen to them and say that you've heard them. It's better if you're having that knowledge and that understanding actually internalized across the business. A company that I love that's doing work around this is called Habituate. There are a bunch of others out there, and there's things you can do internally. You know, our kind of very trolly post mean things on LinkedIn version actually ended up turning into basically we just post a teapot in the Slack channel for general. If someone leaves their laptop unlocked, everyone has a bit of a laugh about it. And it's benign. It's friendly in that sense. Everyone has a joke. You know, the person who does it's like, oh, damn it, I did it again. But what it's doing is reinforcing this idea that security is important and that we are all accountable as a team for the security as an organization. It's not just an engineering problem. It's an everyone problem. So I like that one because I think you can have a lot of fun with it. And again, you know, as you grow, make sure that you're not being super mean about it, because that does get easy as well. There was I can tell some stories, but yeah. Simple one. This is one of those, just, kind of trust me on this one. Get your sales team, get your marketing team, get your finance team onto Chromebooks, or some sort of similar kind of cut down corporate device, before you get too big. This is an especially difficult change to implement once you've gone over 20 or 30 employees. And I know I'm mentioning particular products here as we go along. There's a couple that I think are just good for solving these problems. Chromebooks here I think are one of those, but it sort of goes to the idea of what I'm talking about as well. If you can have your sales team working off iPads or other cut down platforms that are more controlled, that are less likely to have a security impact to them because they're more tightly controlled, and your sales team's actually trained in the ability to actually do their job with something like that, do it. And do it soon, because if you can get them used to that, then you won't need to change it later. Getting organizations to actually shift around that is a difficult thing to do. So it's one of those ones where it's like, yeah, just trust me on this one. I've tried. We've actually done that within different parts of the organization, but people fall in love with the things that they can do with their existing laptop, and it becomes hard to change over time. So save yourself that trouble. Do it early. All right. So the third kind of key takeaway here, and this is an interesting one because this didn't used to be true. I think in my experience in cybersecurity, quite frankly, no one really cared, apart from people that were really zealots about the space, or folks that were really interested in it within technology, until about 5 or 6 years ago. When there became this kind of cadence of bad news. It's like, oh, wow, bad stuff does happen. Like hacking does happen to me. Okay, hacking does happen to me and it hurts. Okay, now the people are talking about my election being hacked. Now my toaster's taking down the internet. And it's just progressively gotten more, I think, top of mind and frankly, a little bit dystopian as we've gone along. What that nets out to is that security is actually becoming a differentiator. So it's not just about your responsibility and your, frankly, like moral imperative to do the right thing by your users. It actually does become an opportunity to differentiate and do a better job of selling your product, which I think is something that if you can internalize and start to try to take advantage of early, you can grow into over time. I actually do think as well that COVID has put this whole phenomena, kind of switched the turbocharger on with it, so to speak, because we've gone from, virtual being a sometimes thing to virtual being default. Working from home, our reliance on technology has driven this subject up to the top very, very quickly. So it's a good one. So on this, and this is the Bug Crowd shout out. I've had a link, excuse me, in the bottom of this presentation that you can go to actually sign up to try the platform out. But be ready for security feedback from the internet, whether you're asking for it or not. What we do is we go out to organizations and we actually encourage them to prepare themselves and actually offer and create channels to corral that feedback, and to get on the front foot. I think where we're up to in terms of, the growth of the internet and the growth of the security research community is that they're just out there looking for stuff, looking for ways to not break in and do, annoying things, but actually break in and try to give you information that's designed to make you and your users more secure. And that's going to happen whether you work with someone like us and actually solicit it actively, or if you don't. From my perspective, the best thing to do is to just predict that, preempt that, and actually start getting in the rhythm of getting external feedback on your organization from the internet. It's kind of like neighborhood watch. It's like when you put that sticker on your mailbox, and all of a sudden, if something bad's going down, you're getting a heads up, and you're actually in a position to be more resilient, and more confident going forward as an organization because of that feedback. It's pretty much the internet version of that. And I believe, particularly when it comes to vulnerability disclosure, it's something that, we're progressively moving towards a point where it's just a normal part of being on the internet. So I think it's a really important thing to expect, and a good thing to prepare for. This is the hot one that always comes in from founders to me. It's like, oh, what do I do about compliance? I'm a B2B startup. I'm trying to, sell into enterprise or larger organizations. They're asking me about SOC 2 Type 2 or ISO standards or whatever else. What do I say? Like, how do I become compliant? The answer to that, I think, for early and seed and Series A is you don't. It's very unlikely that you can go through all of the things that'll make you compliant to, say, ISO 27002, which is a security compliance standard, before you've got enough revenue, before you've got enough capital, before you've got enough ability to even pay an auditor to make that happen. But that doesn't mean you say no. What you can do right away is to be in a position to actually go through those standards that will be relevant to your organization, pick out the requirements. A standard is basically a list of things to do. It's a little bit like this presentation. It's like, do this, do that, do the other thing. Go through them, find the ones that actually make sense for your organization to achieve, that are rational for you to invest in now, and that ideally will create a real security impact for you now. Do those, keep a register of those, and then increase the size of that list over time. As you grow as an organization, you'll hit a point where, oh, cool, we can just call the auditor, go through, get assessed, and all of a sudden, we get our ISO, we get our SOC 2 or whatever else. But in between now and then, when a customer comes to you and says, are you compliant with this? What you can say is, yes, this is what we're working towards as a standard. This is what we have done so far. And you don't have to say no necessarily immediately in that conversation. What I'm not advocating is that you lie and say you're compliant when you're not. But usually in those conversations, you're talking to a procurement team that doesn't necessarily understand the difference. So this gives you the advantage to continue that conversation forward and actually explain what you have done, which I think as a startup is a very handy tool to have in your arsenal, and hopefully something that the hacker hustlers in the audience can take away and make useful, because that, I think, affects pretty much every organization at this point. You've got GDPR in the EU, you've got CCPA and analogs to that in the US. These questions are being asked by all sorts of different organizations of startups. And, the reality, as I said before, is that most people aren't going to go through a full audit for quite some time. So what do you do in the meantime? Hopefully this is a useful answer for you to give there. So yeah, summing it up, really, when you think about what a startup is, it's all about managing risk. Which risks are you going to take? Because they're the ones that give you upside. They're the ones that actually create the opportunity that you get to pursue as an entrepreneur. Which risks are you going to avoid? Which things are you just not going to touch or try to steer away from, or whatever else? That's the fundamental, in my mind, role of a founder in particular, but it's the role of an entrepreneur is to navigate the equities of those risks and keep on making decisions and keep on driving your idea forward out into the market. Cybersecurity is just one of those risks. I think the less people think of it as this like spooky, hoodies in basements, scary green text thing, and more as just literally a normal part of risk management in an organization, the less scary it becomes, the more practical it can be as something that you incorporate in how you grow. And then the more empowered you are to actually make changes. So really, start working on it today. And as I said before, some of these slides will be up online, you can refer back through them if I've gone through them too quickly, because I know there was a lot there, but I think there was some good points that anyone can kind of take at least one or two from and start working on literally today. Thank you.
Thanks, Casey. As a reminder to the audience, the Q&A is still open. We won't be monitoring the chat, but we'll get to as many questions in the next 10 minutes as possible, so feel free to submit them there. The first question from an attendee is, what needs to happen in the first few minutes and few hours and few days following a breach or credible evidence of some kind of intrusion?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, step zero is don't panic. A lot of the time when startups go through this, there's a very distinct difference between people that have been through breaches and people that are going through it for the first time. I and others within BugCrowd had the advantage of either experiencing on the receiving end or having helped organizations through breaches prior to doing BugCrowd. So, that kind of idea of mentally being bomb-proof and not acting out of panic. If you've got it to work with as you go into a situation like that, great. If you don't, that's really the thing to remember, is don't freak out. from there, it really becomes a matter of, understanding what the impact has actually been, like burning down to the root cause as quickly as you can. What you hear, what you know, even what might start up on Twitter or whatever else might not align with the facts, and you need to focus on the facts first, because that's your responsibility. That's the thing that you do have domain control over. And I think a really practical tip for startups that I see people screw up a lot is don't refer to it as a breach until it is a breach, until it's absolutely confirmed that it is a breach. A breach at this point in time, because of the different regulations that have come in, has a very specific definition. And once you as an organization have acknowledged it as a breach, it kicks off a very specific set of things. And if it is, you need to do that. So don't hear what I'm not saying there. But what often happens is, oh, we got breached, almost as a default reaction to an incident, without understanding that unintended consequence. So those are a few things there.
It's a really good answer. We've got one more in as well. What's your thoughts on incentivizing employees to stay secure, creating kind of like a public security score per se for each employee?
For each employee, yeah, it's a fun idea. This is actually something that I've noodled on, as an ideator for a while, because every user is different. You've got users that are going to be good at security. You've got users that are going to be not good at security. Then you're going to have users that are just frankly terrible and not likely to get better over time, right? And that's humans. That's just how it is. There's not a judgment call on any of those groups. It's just sort of how it is. So this idea of almost like for want of a better word, a gullibility score, and the ability to wrap controls around that is something that I've been fascinated by. I think the challenge with it is that it kind of makes you look bad whether you want it to or not. So I think navigating that particular side effect of doing something like that's an unsolved problem. But I do think that as a solution is something that we're going to end up interacting with at some point in the future. And really, when you think about how enterprises do security today, they kind of already do bits of that. This is not a diss on sales teams, but for example, sales teams will have more lockdown and less privileged access to systems than people in IT engineering, for example. Even my recommendation of Chromebooks for the marketing team is kind of a subset of this. It's not because they're stupid or because they're bad at security. It's because they're less likely to be thinking about this stuff top of mind as they do their job. So if you can just be ahead of that, then you're automatically reducing your risk as an organization.
It's interesting as well, because I know some companies use, they try to make security a positive thing. So that, if you get a phishing email, you report it straight away. It's a positive experience rather than one that's a negative one.
Yeah, no, definitely. I was actually deliberate when I was putting this deck together not to go through the laundry list of here's all of the bad stuff that's happened to startups that have gotten this wrong. Because, partly I assume people that are watching this have already thought that through themselves. But also, honestly, I believe that security, we're at a point where it needs to be more about the carrot than the stick. Like we've been doing the stick thing for the last 30 years. There's been some progress, but I think broadly speaking, it hasn't worked. So, how do you turn it into something that's actually rewarding for a user to be good at?
We've got one more question in as well. How do you balance budget and security?
Yeah, this is with great difficulty. I think is the the blanket answer to that. There's a lot of different answers in terms of the math that can be applied as best practices as the security grows as a function of overall IT spend and stuff like that. I would say it needs to be thoughtful. If it's an afterthought, if it's just 2% of our IT spend, or if it's crap, we don't have any money, we need to go find some, or whatever else. If it's in that sort of bucket in terms of your approach, you're probably doing it wrong, and you're probably missing out. If you're, instead of that, actually thinking about it and saying, okay, this is business risk we're talking about. Security is a part of engineering fundamentally, but it is a part of overall risk management of the organization. Like, how are we spending money on it as a proportion of what goes out the door? just making sure that's a part of how you proactively budget and do budget cycles. I think that's the best piece of advice I can give for early stage companies.
We've got just time for one more question.
Sure.
Another question that came in is, what are some of the companies that are doing cybersecurity well, but not getting the coverage that they deserve?
Oof. Wow, that's a tough one. Define well. I mean, I think at this point in time, there is, organizations that actually handle breaches well, in terms of transparency and response, and keeping their user informed around what they can do to protect themselves, not just, oh, we take your data seriously and we're very sorry and here's some credit reporting. I have a lot of respect for that, because it's hard. Like, you've already been kicked, and then you've got to go and humble yourself in front of your user. So I think organizations that do that well, I have tremendous respect for. I can't think of any top of mind. But I do also think the folks that have the most difficult job in security at the moment, I think, are the enterprises that are sort of accidentally agile. So they've got this like historical waterfall approach to IT and development, and they've really built their business around that for the past, it could be 100+ years, literally, and IT just appeared at the end of that. And now they've got teams that are trying to do CI/CD and throw COVID and work from home on top of that. All of a sudden, we're in the middle of this great zero trust experiment, and they're having to try to wrap their arms around that. So I think the folks that are being proactive about that are pretty awesome as well.
Yeah. All right, so that's all the time we have right now. Before we go, as a reminder, a follow-up to this conversation will be available on Extra Crunch in the next few days. So be sure to look out for that. I also want to thank Casey Ellis, the founder, chairman, and chief technology officer at Bugfound, for your time. It's much appreciated. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for being with us today for this session on how to prioritize security at your startup. Thanks so much for joining us.
Likewise.